Dr. Sarah Bennett's morning began like any other Tuesday, reviewing transportation proposals in her home office while sipping her morning coffee. The gentle autumn sunlight streamed through her window, illuminating the numerous academic achievements that adorned her walls, a testament to decades of hard work and dedication. At precisely 9:17 a.m., everything changed with a single phone call. "Ms. Bennett." The hospital nurse's voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's heart skip. "Your mother has suffered a severe stroke. She's asking for you, but her condition is critical. You should come immediately." Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her belongings. Her mother, Eleanor Bennett, had been her cornerstone. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to put her through college, who had never missed a graduation, who had taught her to hold her head high in a world that often tried to diminish her worth. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Navigating through the city's morning traffic, Sarah maintained a steady speed until she reached Madison Avenue. The hospital was just 3 miles ahead when the traffic came to a complete standstill. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slow as she watched an accident being cleared ahead. With each passing moment, her mother's chances could be diminishing. Making a split-second decision, Sarah turned onto a side street, accelerating beyond the speed limit. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her academic background in urban planning making her acutely aware of every traffic pattern she was breaking. But in this moment, statistics and regulations meant nothing compared to reaching her mother's bedside. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her stomach sink. Officer James Miller approached her vehicle, his face set in that familiar mask of authority she had encountered too many times before. Sarah rolled down her window, her professional demeanor warring with her mounting desperation. "License and registration," Officer Miller demanded, his tone clipped and dismissive. "Officer, please," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. "My mother is in critical condition at Metropolitan Hospital. I just received the call. She's had a stroke, and I need to." "Ma'am, do you know how fast you were going?" He cut her off, seemingly uninterested in her explanation. 62 in a 40 zone. That's more than 20 over the limit." Sarah felt her throat tighten as she fumbled for her documents. "I understand, but this is an emergency. I can provide the hospital's contact information." "I've heard every excuse in the book," Officer Miller interrupted again, studying her license with barely concealed skepticism. "The law applies to everyone, Dr. Bennett. Or did your degree make you think you're above it?" The casual condescension in his tone was familiar, a subtle reminder of the barriers she had faced throughout her career. But right now, her thoughts were only with her mother, whose life hung in the balance while she sat detained on a side street. Writing the ticket seemed to take an eternity. When Officer Miller finally handed her the citation, his parting words carried a smugness that would haunt her. "Next time, leave earlier if you have somewhere important to be." Sarah arrived at Metropolitan Hospital 17 minutes later, her heart pounding as she rushed through the sterile corridors. But she was too late. Eleanor Bennett had passed away 5 minutes before her arrival, her last words asking for her daughter. Standing in the cold hospital hallway, the traffic citation crumpled in her trembling hand. Dr. Sarah Bennett felt the weight of the system that had just robbed her of a final goodbye with her mother. The ticket wasn't just a fine. It was a stark reminder of how institutional indifference could shatter lives in ways that could never be repaired. 2 weeks after Eleanor Bennett's funeral, the courthouse loomed before Sarah like a medieval fortress. The classical architecture, meant to inspire awe and respect for justice, now felt like a monument to institutional indifference. Her black dress, still carrying the faint scent of funeral flowers, seemed appropriate for what felt like another kind of mourning, the death of her faith in the system she had worked so hard to be part of. Judge Michael Harrison's courtroom operated with the mechanical precision of a factory assembly line. From his elevated bench, he processed cases with ruthless efficiency, his gavel falling like a metronome, marking the steady pace of justice, or what passed for it in traffic courtroom 237. Sarah observed the proceedings while waiting for her case to be called. A young Hispanic mother, trying to explain her broken taillight through broken English, received a maximum fine. An elderly black man attempting to contest a parking ticket was cut short mid-sentence. Harrison's justice was swift, but it carried distinct patterns that Sarah's analytical mind couldn't help but notice. Docket number 47,293. Dr. Sarah Bennett. The court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the wood-paneled chamber. Sarah approached the podium, her posture straight, her demeanor professional despite the grief still etched in the shadows under her eyes. She had prepared her statement meticulously, gathering hospital records, death certificates, and even a letter from the attending physician confirming her mother's time of death. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and measured. I wish to explain the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this traffic violation. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his pen poised to write yet another fine. The officer's report indicates you were traveling 22 miles over the posted limit. Do you dispute this fact? No, Your Honor, but the circumstances were. The circumstances, Harrison interrupted, his tone dripping with practiced condescension, do not change the posted speed limit, Miss Bennett. Dr. Bennett, she corrected firmly, her years of fighting for recognition surfacing even in her grief. And with all due respect, Your Honor, my mother was dying. Harrison's gavel cracked against the sound block. That will be enough, Dr. Bennett. He emphasized her title with subtle mockery. This court has heard every possible excuse for speeding. Your credentials don't grant you special privileges on our roads. Sarah felt her throat tighten, but she persisted. I have documentation from Metropolitan Hospital confirming my mother's critical condition and time of death, which occurred just minutes before. Maximum fine of $500, Harrison declared, already reaching for the next case file. Plus court costs. Pay the clerk on your way out. Next case. The dismissal hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stood frozen at the podium, the carefully prepared documents trembling in her hands. In that moment, she wasn't Dr. Sarah Bennett, the accomplished academic and newly elected city commissioner. She was every person who had ever stood in this courtroom, their stories unheard, their humanity disregarded. As she turned to leave, Sarah noticed a young law student in the gallery frantically taking notes. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Sarah made a decision. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about a system that needed change, and she was now in a position to catalyze that change. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant. Cancel my afternoon meetings, she instructed, and get me everything you can find on Judge Michael Harrison's judicial record. Every case, every decision, every pattern. She paused at her car, looking back at the courthouse. It's time we shed some light on traffic courtroom 237. The City Hall chambers buzzed with anticipation as the monthly urban development meeting commenced. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his usual seat near the front, his polished appearance and confident demeanor masking his exhaustion after another demanding day in court. As chairman of the Judicial Oversight Committee, his attendance at these meetings was mandatory, though he typically viewed them as a tedious obligation. Next on our agenda, announced Mayor Richardson, we'll hear from our new City Commissioner of Transportation regarding the proposed traffic safety initiatives. Harrison absently adjusted his tie, barely glancing up as footsteps approached the podium. His world tilted on its axis when he heard a familiar voice, one he had dismissed mere hours ago. Thank you, Mayor Richardson. Dr. Sarah Bennett began, her voice carrying the same dignified tone she had maintained in his courtroom. Today, I'm presenting a comprehensive analysis of our city's traffic enforcement patterns and their impact on community safety. Harrison's hand, reaching for his water glass, froze midair. The woman commanding the room's attention was unmistakably the same individual he had treated with such dismissive contempt that morning. But here she stood, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, her presence emanating authority that even he couldn't ignore. As Dr. Bennett proceeded with her presentation, Each word felt like a carefully aimed arrow. "Our data reveals troubling disparities in traffic enforcement across different neighborhoods," she continued, bringing up a series of meticulously researched charts. "Particularly concerning are the patterns of maximum fines being issued disproportionately to minority residents." Harrison felt a bead of sweat roll down his collar as she methodically dissected the very system he had wielded so carelessly for years. Her expertise was evident in every statistical analysis, every policy recommendation, every pointed observation about judicial discretion. "Furthermore," she added, her eyes briefly meeting his, "we've documented numerous cases where valid extenuating circumstances were systematically dismissed without proper consideration, leading to unnecessary hardships for our citizens." The council members nodded appreciatively at her thorough analysis, while Harrison fought to maintain his composure. His mind raced back through countless cases, countless dismissals, countless times he had wielded his gavel like a weapon rather than an instrument of justice. During the question and answer session, Dr. Bennett handled each inquiry with remarkable expertise, demonstrating not only her deep understanding of urban planning, but also her intimate knowledge of legal procedures. Harrison found himself shrinking in his chair as she referenced specific statutes he should have considered in his own rulings. As the meeting concluded, Harrison remained rooted to his chair, watching as various council members congratulated Dr. Bennett on her presentation. Mayor Richardson's words carried clearly across the chamber. "This is exactly why we needed someone of your caliber in this position. Dr. Bennett, your combination of academic expertise and practical understanding of our community's needs is invaluable." Later that evening, alone in his chambers, Harrison pulled up Dr. Bennett's case file from that morning. Her credentials jumped out at him now. Ph.D. in urban planning from Harvard, numerous published papers on community-oriented traffic management, years of advocacy work in transportation equity. All this information had been right there in front of him, yet he had chosen not to see it, just as he had chosen not to see so much else. He closed the file and walked to his window, watching the city lights flicker to life in the growing dusk. For the first time in his judicial career, Judge Michael Harrison felt the uncomfortable weight of being judged himself and found wanting. The video began innocuously enough, just another day in traffic courtroom 237. But as it progressed through a series of cases heard by Judge Harrison, a disturbing pattern emerged. The shaky smartphone footage, recorded by that observant law student, had captured 23 cases in succession. Analysis revealed that defendants of color received maximum fines 87% of the time, while white defendants were granted leniency in 64% of cases. Dr. Sarah Bennett's case featured prominently in the middle of the compilation. The contrast between her dignified attempt to explain her circumstances and Harrison's dismissive interruptions became a powerful centerpiece of the viral exposé. Local news stations ran the clip in heavy rotation, juxtaposing it with footage of Dr. Bennett's commanding presence at City Hall. "The disparity is stark," noted civil rights attorney Marcus Rodriguez on Channel 5's Evening News. "We see a highly qualified professional woman, grieving the loss of her mother, being treated with the same institutional contempt that has characterized our justice system's treatment of minorities for generations." Harrison's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and journalists. Each notification felt like another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed reputation. The courthouse steps, usually quiet by late afternoon, now hosted impromptu press conferences where community activists demanded accountability. Inside his chambers, Harrison watched as his face appeared on the evening news yet again. The split screen showed him dismissing Dr. Bennett's explanation on one side, while the other displayed her impressive biographical details. Harvard doctorate, published author, community leader, and now, city commissioner. Judge Harrison's conduct raises serious questions about bias in our traffic court system, the news anchor intoned. Sources within City Hall confirm that an official investigation into his judicial record has been initiated. The situation reached a crescendo when the State Judicial Review Board announced their intention to examine Harrison's entire case history. Decades of decisions would be scrutinized, patterns analyzed, disparities documented. The mechanical efficiency he had prided himself on now seemed damning rather than commendable. Walking through the courthouse parking lot that evening, Harrison encountered Dr. Bennett near her car. The awkward moment stretched between them like a chasm. "Dr. Bennett," he began, his judicial authority stripped away by circumstance, "I owe you an—" "Save it, Judge Harrison," she interrupted, her voice level but firm. "This isn't about me or my case or even my mother anymore. This is about every person who has stood before you, whose story you refuse to hear. Your apology means nothing if it doesn't lead to systemic change." As she drove away, Harrison noticed the growing crowd of reporters at the courthouse entrance. Their cameras tracked his movement, hungry for reaction shots and sound bites. His usual route to his car suddenly felt like a gauntlet. That night, reviewing the video for the 100th time, Harrison finally saw what everyone else did, not just his bias, but his casual cruelty. The way he wielded power without wisdom, authority without understanding. The realization sat heavy in his chest as he drafted his response to the Judicial Review Board's inquiry. His computer screen illuminated his office as he typed, deleted, and retyped his statement. Outside his window, a lone photographer waited in the darkness, hoping to catch the moment when justice itself would be called to account. Dr. Sarah Bennett's decision to advocate for judicial reform rather than Judge Harrison's removal shocked the city's political establishment. During an emergency session of the City Council, she stood at the podium, her voice unwavering as she addressed the crowded chamber. "Removing one judge doesn't address the systemic issues plaguing our justice system," she declared, her words carrying the weight of personal experience. "What we need is comprehensive reform, and Judge Harrison's case presents an opportunity for meaningful change." In the back of the chamber, Harrison sat alone, his usual allies having distanced themselves amid the controversy. He listened as Dr. Bennett outlined her proposal, a partnership between the Transportation Commission and the judiciary to develop new guidelines for traffic court proceedings. The initiative would require judges to document their reasoning for maximum fines, implement mandatory cultural sensitivity training, and establish a community oversight board. Most surprisingly, she named Harrison as a potential co-chair of the Reform Committee. "Sometimes," she continued, meeting Harrison's stunned gaze, "those who have been part of the problem can become the most effective advocates for change if they're willing to confront their own biases honestly and publicly." Following the session, reporters swarmed them both. "Dr. Bennett, why support the judge who dismissed your mother's case?" one journalist shouted. Another called out, "Judge Harrison, how do you respond to allegations of systematic bias in your courtroom?" Dr. Bennett raised her hand for silence. "Judge Harrison, and I will be holding a joint press conference tomorrow morning. For now, we have work to do." In Harrison's chambers, the tension was palpable as they sat across from each other for the first time since their courtroom encounter. The judge's office, once his sanctuary of authority, now felt like neutral ground in an unexpected negotiation. "Why?" Harrison finally asked, his voice stripped of its judicial formality. "Why offer me this chance?" Dr. Bennett placed a thick folder on his desk, statistical analyses of his court decisions over the past decade. "Because these numbers tell me you're not inherently cruel, just deeply entrenched in a flawed system. And because change requires both perspective, mine from the outside, and yours from within." Their subsequent meetings stretched into late nights, analyzing data, drafting proposals, and sharing increasingly candid conversations about race, power, and justice. Harrison found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about his own prejudices, while Dr. Bennett challenged her own assumptions about institutional change. The local media tracked their unlikely collaboration with fascination. Some praised their efforts as a model for addressing systemic racism, while others accused them of political theater. Social media buzzed with debates about whether true redemption was possible for someone in Harrison's position. During one particularly heated planning session, Harrison confessed, "I sentenced thousands of people without ever really seeing them." How do you remedy that kind of blindness? You start by acknowledging it, Dr. Bennett replied, pushing another case file across his desk. Then you do the hard work of making it right, one case at a time. Their reform proposal faced resistance from both sides, conservatives who thought it too radical and progressives who deemed it insufficient. But as they presented their findings at community forums and professional conferences, their partnership became a powerful testament to the possibility of institutional change. One evening, as they reviewed the final draft of their proposal, Dr. Bennett received a text message. The law student who had recorded the original viral video had just been accepted into a prestigious civil rights law program. They shared a knowing look, understanding that their unexpected alliance was already inspiring the next generation of changemakers. The transformation of Judge Michael Harrison came at a steep personal price. His wife, Catherine Harrison, a prominent civil rights attorney, sat across their dining room table one evening, the untouched dinner growing cold between them. The local newspaper featuring Harrison's latest reform initiative lay beside her plate, its headlines a silent accusation. 23 years, Catherine said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. I spent 23 years fighting systemic racism in the courts, and all this time, I was married to a man who perpetuated it. Harrison reached for words to defend himself, but found none. The security footage from his courtroom had revealed truths he couldn't deny, not to his wife, not to himself. I'm trying to make it right, he offered. That's what makes this harder, Catherine replied, her professional composure cracking. Watching you work with Dr. Bennett, seeing you finally acknowledge what I've been fighting against my entire career, it forces me to question everything about our relationship. Their teenage daughter, Emma, had her own reckoning. A junior at the city's most diverse public high school, she faced pointed questions from classmates about her father's conduct. The viral video had made her a reluctant celebrity, and not in a way any 16-year-old would want. How could you not know? Emma demanded one evening, tears streaming down her face. My best friend Destiny's mom appeared in your court last year. She lost her job because she couldn't pay your fine. Did you even look at her when you made that decision? Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett faced her own challenges. Community activists who had initially celebrated her appointment now accused her of coddling the oppressor. Outside her office, protesters carried signs reading "Justice delayed is justice denied," and "Collaboration is complicity." During a particularly heated community meeting, Marcus Washington, a respected civil rights leader, confronted her publicly. Your mother didn't get to say goodbye because of this man's prejudice, he declared. How can you stand beside him now? Dr. Bennett maintained her composure, though those who knew her could see the toll these confrontations took. My mother taught me that true change requires difficult conversations with uncomfortable allies, she responded. She also taught me that revenge and reform are not the same thing. The pressure mounted from all sides. Harrison's old friends in the judiciary distanced themselves, viewing his collaboration with Dr. Bennett as a betrayal. Conservative talk radio branded him a social justice convert, while progressive platforms questioned the authenticity of his change of heart. One evening, after a particularly grueling reform committee meeting, Harrison found himself driving past Metropolitan Hospital, where Dr. Bennett's mother had died. He pulled into the parking lot and sat there, remembering all the times he had dismissed emergency explanations in his courtroom. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Emma's doing a school project on judicial bias. She wants to interview you. Your choice. As he stared at the message, another notification appeared. An email from the State Judicial Review Board requesting additional documentation of his past cases. The personal and professional consequences of his awakening were becoming increasingly intertwined. Back at home, Harrison found Emma waiting in his study, laptop open, ready to record. Her expression held both accusation and hope, a combination he was becoming familiar with. Dad, she began, I need you to explain how you didn't see what you were doing, and more importantly, what you're going to do about it now. The answer to her question would determine not just his professional legacy, but the future of his most precious relationships. The community forum was held in the First Baptist Church's Fellowship Hall, a neutral ground chosen deliberately for its historical significance in the civil rights movement. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls, all eyes fixed on the unlikely pair at the podium, Judge Harrison and Dr. Bennett. Harrison stepped forward first, his judicial robe absent, dressed instead in a simple suit that seemed to strip away his usual authority. The microphone captured his slight tremor as he began speaking. "I spent 20 years believing I was upholding the law," he started, his voice carrying to the rafters. "What I failed to understand was how I was perpetuating a system of inequality under the guise of justice." The audience remained silent as he methodically presented the data from his courtroom. The disproportionate fines, the dismissed explanations, the patterns of bias that could no longer be denied. Raw numbers transformed into stories of real people whose lives had been impacted by his decisions. But numbers alone don't capture the human cost, Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. They don't show the missed goodbyes, the lost jobs, the cascading consequences of fines that might seem minor to some but devastating to others. Dr. Bennett then approached the podium, carrying a framed photograph. "This is my mother, Eleanor Bennett," she said, holding up the image for all to see. "She raised me alone, worked multiple jobs to put me through school, and taught me that education was the key to changing broken systems from within." The photograph showed a dignified black woman in her nursing uniform, her smile radiating pride and determination. "The day she died," Dr. Bennett continued, "I was racing to say goodbye. Judge Harrison's court treated my emergency like just another excuse. But today, we're not here to dwell on that loss. We're here to ensure it creates lasting change." Together, they unveiled their comprehensive reform proposal. It went beyond mere sensitivity training, introducing a revolutionary system of community oversight, transparent documentation of judicial decisions, and regular audits of sentencing patterns. From the audience, Marcus Washington stood up. "Judge Harrison," he called out, his voice carrying decades of community leadership, "how can we trust that this isn't just performance, that you won't revert to old patterns when the spotlight fades?" Harrison met his gaze steadily. "Because I have to look my daughter in the eye every day," he responded. "Because my wife deserves a partner who upholds the principles she's fought for. And because once you see the truth about yourself, you can't unsee it." The discussion that followed was raw and honest. Community members shared their experiences in Harrison's courtroom and others like it. Some stories brought tears, others anger, but each contributed to a deeper understanding of the changes needed. As the evening drew to a close, an elderly woman approached the podium. She had been sitting quietly throughout the forum, carefully observing every interaction. "I worked as a courthouse janitor for 30 years, she announced. "I've seen judges come and go, all making promises, but this is the first time I've seen one admit they were wrong and actually do something about it." Her words hung in the air as the forum concluded. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the church steps, where Dr. Bennett and Judge Harrison stood, watching as community members lingered, forming small groups, continuing the difficult but necessary conversations that real change requires. The local news crews captured it all, not just the presentations and proposals, but the genuine moments of human connection that suggested that perhaps, this time, things might actually change. 1 year later, Judge Harrison's courtroom bore little resemblance to its former self. Gone was the assembly line efficiency that had once been his pride. Instead, Traffic Courtroom 237 had become a model for judicial reform, with observers from across the country regularly filling the gallery. On this particular morning, a young black medical student, Dr. Maya Richardson, stood before him, her hospital ID still clipped to her white coat. She had been cited for running a red light while rushing to respond to a code blue emergency at the Children's Hospital. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the same tension Dr. Bennett's had a year ago. "I know speeding through an intersection was dangerous, but my patient was a 6-year-old girl in cardiac arrest." Harrison listened intently, noting how his younger self would have dismissed her explanation without a second thought. "Do you have documentation of the emergency, Dr. Richardson?" he asked, his tone measured and respectful. From her seat in the gallery, Dr. Bennett watched the proceedings with careful attention. She had made a point of randomly monitoring court sessions, ensuring that the reforms they had implemented remained more than just words on paper. Dr. Richardson produced her hospital logs and a statement from the attending physician. Harrison reviewed them thoroughly, something that would have been unthinkable in his previous incarnation. The gallery remained silent, many recognizing the parallels to the case that had catalyzed this transformation. "Dr. Richardson," Harrison began his ruling, "while the court acknowledges the gravity of your emergency, we must balance that against public safety." He paused, making eye contact with the young doctor. "I'm ordering you to conduct 3 sessions of traffic safety awareness at the hospital's resident orientation program. Your medical expertise, combined with this experience, could help other healthcare workers better navigate similar emergencies." The ruling represented everything their reforms stood for. Accountability balanced with understanding, punishment transformed into community benefit. Dr. Richardson's visible relief reflected not just the ruling itself, but the dignity with which she had been treated. After the session, Dr. Bennett approached the bench. "The press is calling it the Harrison Doctrine now," she remarked, referencing the growing adoption of their reforms by other jurisdictions. "Though I notice you're taking twice as long to process cases these days." "Justice shouldn't be measured in minutes," Harrison replied, a statement that would have been unthinkable coming from him a year ago. "How's the new traffic management system working out?" "Automated emergency vehicle alerts have reduced critical response times by 30%, she answered, "though I suspect you know that from the quarterly reports." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma Harrison entering the courtroom, now a freshman majoring in criminal justice. She had become a regular presence, her school project having evolved into a passionate commitment to reform. "Dad," she called out, "the law school wants you and Dr. Bennett to speak at their symposium on judicial bias next month. They're calling it Breaking Patterns, the Human Face of Justice Reform." As they stood there, the judge, the commissioner, and the daughter who had helped hold her father accountable, they represented different facets of a change that went beyond policies and procedures. The viral video that had exposed Harrison's bias still circulated online, but now it was paired with footage of the reformed court, offering a powerful before and after testimony to the possibility of genuine transformation. Outside Traffic Courtroom 237, the city continued its own evolution, each small change contributing to a larger shift in how justice was conceived and delivered. It wasn't perfect. No system ever is. But it was proof that even the most entrenched patterns could be broken when those with power chose to confront their own biases and work alongside those they had once dismissed.